Oh, hi! It's me, Magenta with a J, and I'm here to talk politics. Now, I know some of you are already lapping up every ounce of political drama going on right now, but some of you just don't have the taste for politics. It's too divisive, too depressing, too confusing, or just too damn much. Even if it doesn't feel necessarily day to day that stuff is affecting you directly, there's a lot of things that you may want to consider. Do you want giant corporations like Amazon to pay almost no taxes or zero taxes while middle class people have to struggle to pay their bills and pay their taxes? Do you think it's fair to say that people aren't allowed in the United States because of their religion? Do you think it's fair that Black Americans are 5 times more likely to be put in prison than white Americans? Do you think it's fair that you could go bankrupt for having cancer? These are the kinds of things that you have to think about when you are considering whether to be involved in politics, because your vote does matter. So while politics can be a drag, I'm here to take it from sickening to sickening. No? So I'm filming this on February 17, 2020. A couple weeks ago, Donald Trump was acquitted in his impeachment trial, and the biggest political story has moved on to the Democratic primaries, where we're hoping to find a replacement for the man who puts children in cages and gives medals of honor to homophobic racists. I would love to say that that was an exaggeration, but that's objective fact. So far in the Democratic primaries, we have had 2 states vote, Iowa and New Hampshire. And in Iowa, which was a total shit show, we'll get to that in a minute, there was kind of a split decision between Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg. They have both claimed victory, but there isn't actually an official winner yet. And New Hampshire went a lot more smoothly, and Bernie Sanders did in fact win, but Pete came in second. So, how do these primaries work? I would love to make this a little more accessible to people that maybe don't know all the ins and outs. So you may wonder, why doesn't the whole country just vote at once to pick who we want for the Democratic Party? Well, going state by state has some advantages. One, it allows candidates who may not have the most money and name recognition to kind of build up a following as they go state to state. And the other aspect is it forces all of the candidates to spend some time actually campaigning in every state so they're not just addressing national issues. So on the whole, I think it's probably a positive that we do it in this manner, but I can understand why some people find it a bit tiring because it does take 4 months. So this election has been particularly eventful because there have been an enormous number of candidates for the Democratic Party. Over 24, in fact. And while some of them have dropped out, we are down to probably about 6 still that potentially could be the Democratic nominee. So I figured, since most of you have not yet voted, that it might be helpful to give a little bit of a breakdown of all the candidates. I'm going to try to be objective here and not let my personal biases influence you, although I do have favorites. I'm kind of going to give the pros and cons, at least, that I'm hearing out there. First up, we have Joe Biden. So he is the former vice president under Obama and was a senator from Delaware for a very long time. So throughout 2019, people really thought he was the most electable against Trump because voters consistently are saying the most important thing to them, at least in the Democratic side, is just to defeat Trump. They care less about the specific policies and more about just getting him out of office, which is understandable, but I think you should still focus on things that are actually important to you at a policy level for whoever you're going to support. Biden is considered a moderate, so he doesn't want to push things really far to the left. He kind of wants to just return us to how things were during Obama, which a lot of people are very fond of. Other people wish that we actually would move forward rather than moving backwards. One of the criticisms of Biden is that he is old. He is 77, and that he sounds old. He has some outdated references and policy positions, and one of the biggest things that he is criticized for are some of his stances on crime, in the 90s in particular, supporting some bills that are widely considered to have had an extremely negative impact on communities of color. So his stances then don't really hold up very well today. Another thing that's kind of going against him now is that for all this talk of being the most electable, he lost Iowa and New Hampshire pretty bad. He ended up 4th in Iowa and 5th in New Hampshire. So it's hard to argue that he's electable when he's losing this badly out of the gate. However, a lot of people say that he's going to do well once the votes start coming in from the South, where there's a larger population of people of color, which somehow, despite his record, seems to be the group that gives him the most support. So we'll see if those polls for that are accurate or if things are actually different as we move through the rest of the states. Our next candidate is Pete Buttigieg, the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, a small city of about 100,000 people. Nobody knew of him about a year ago. He's 38. He's actually a year younger than me, which is insane to me. He's gay. Yeah, same. And he's a veteran and a Rhodes Scholar, and he speaks like 7 languages. He's got an interesting background, so to speak. And he got a little bit of media coverage early on that he really very successfully turned into a much larger base of support. And in fact, he has been in the top 2 in both Iowa and New Hampshire. So the voters thus far do like him. And what they seem to like are the fact that he almost talks like a Republican when he's talking about issues. He frames them in terms of faith, in terms of military service, things that are typically more Republican talking points. And you can make an argument that that's a successful way to win over the middle. But you could also make an argument that maybe you don't want somebody that sounds like a Republican. And in fact, I will say that despite him being gay, which surprisingly to me has not actually been a major campaign issue, the LGBTQ community kind of hates his guts. There's actually a meme where the LGBTQ acronym is being used to say, let's get Buttigieg to quit. People feel like he's kind of distancing himself from the community. There's stories about him and fundraisers and trying to keep the drag queens away or anything that could resemble something that's more stereotypically gay. So a lot of people don't like that. One of the other biggest criticisms of him is his record on racial issues. When he became mayor of South Bend, which is a fairly diverse city, he fired the black police chief for taping conversations where he was trying to prove that the department was racist against him. And the number of arrests of black teens for marijuana actually went up compared to the state average. So he didn't exactly have a great record with supporting minorities in his own community. So there's a big question around if any black voters are actually going to support him. However, he is doing really well, particularly for somebody with such a short amount of experience and so little known until this particular primary season. Next up, Bernie Sanders. I think everybody probably knows who he is by now. He ran against Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination in 2016 and actually got very close despite being a Democratic socialist. He doesn't consider himself part of the Democratic Party, but was realistic and pragmatic about it being the only way for him to potentially become president was to work through the Democratic Party rather than trying to go independent. The socialist moniker, even though he's a democratic socialist, which is a little bit different, is already being used against him. A lot of people just reflexively think that that term is something bad. However, his response is typically to explain the programs that he supports, things like healthcare for all, free state college, erasing student loan debt, closing the income gap between the wealthy and the poor. So these are things that most people are like, yeah, those are good ideas. Perhaps because of this, he is actually considered the front runner at this point because he won New Hampshire and actually won the popular vote in Iowa, although it's in question whether he actually won the most delegates. Just pretend Iowa didn't happen because it was nuts. It was terrible. Some of the arguments against Bernie, he's old. He's even older than Biden. I believe he is 78, and he had a heart attack in the fall, although he recovered very quickly and seems to be doing well, at least from what we see on TV. And then probably the biggest issue is this whole thing about Bernie bros. So particularly people online that are his supporters are often pretty nasty and awful, and they attack the supporters of other candidates in a way that doesn't really reflect Sanders' stances, but kind of makes him look bad by association. So it's really not Sanders' fault that that's happening, but it is definitely a criticism of his campaign. One big note about him, he has tremendous support among young people, and in fact, if only younger people, I'm not even sure what the line is, it could be as old as 50 perhaps, were voting, he would win this in a landslide. But older voters don't like him nearly as much. So just keep that in mind. You're probably a younger person if you're watching this. So make sure to vote if you are eligible to. Our next candidate is Elizabeth Warren, who is often considered sort of similar to Sanders in her political stances and policies. They are really the two most progressive left-leaning candidates in the race. In 2019, her polls just kept going up, and it looked like she might become the front runner. But then things kind of fell apart, and now that voting has started, she came in third in Iowa and fourth in New Hampshire. There's a big question around if she'll be able to continue forward and regain some traction. But the main things to know about her are, again, a lot of the same policies as Sanders. Her focus tends to be more about economics, money, and fighting corruption and the corrupting forces of money. Her most well-known proposal is a wealth tax for people making more than $50 million. So it's a very small number of people that are affected by this, but they're very powerful people, and they do not like that. When it comes to criticisms of Warren, there has been this question around potential sexism in how people vote, which unfortunately has seemed to have hurt her rather than helped her. It really should not be an issue when you consider who you're voting for, but somehow this cycle, everybody seems to be picking who they want based on who they think other people would want. Just go for the person that you like. I don't get it. There is one other woman who is a very serious contender in the race, and she was a bit of a long shot until recently, and that's Amy Klobuchar. She is a senator from Minnesota. She has been positioning herself as sort of the ideal moderate in between old-fashioned Joe Biden and too young and inexperienced Pete Buttigieg. She's very practical and pragmatic, and she has criticized some of the more progressive plans by other candidates by saying they're just not realistic, they're never going to happen. We have to go for things that will actually be achievable. And that has appealed to some people, and in fact, despite polling in like 4% range just a month or two ago, she got more votes in New Hampshire than Biden and Warren combined. The problem with pitching yourself as pragmatic and practical is it's hard to get super inspired by that, so there's a big question about whether she could really engage younger voters and minority voters. So I still think it's probably unlikely that she'll be the nominee, but at this point you never know. And finally, we have a big wild card, which is former New York City Mayor Mike Bloomberg. He is worth about $60 billion, so you can probably guess that Sanders and Warren don't like him very much. He's taking a very different approach where he's not even on the ballot in the first few states. He has been spending tons of his own money. I think it might be more than all of the other candidates combined. He's even paying people to make memes for him because he's hoping that once the first few states vote and there's still a bit of unclearness around who is in the lead, that he can swoop in and win a bunch of states and win this thing. There's a lot of reasons to be skeptical of him. He used to be a Republican. He's being accused of many by trying to buy the election. He also has a pretty spotty record, like a few other candidates actually, around racial issues, including supporting stop and frisk, and in fact fighting for it in court in New York City. If you're not familiar with what stop and frisk is, it was a directive to the police to specifically target young men of color, even if they had not done anything wrong, under the belief that if they were constantly harassing them, they'd be less likely to carry guns. He has since apologized for it, but it's only a few years ago, so it's a little hard for me to believe personally that all of that's in the past and he's completely changed. But who knows? Those that do support him like that he has a very successful history as a businessman and that he does have tons of money, so they feel like there's more resources to fight Trump. So there are still a lot of other candidates in the race, but I've highlighted the ones that are considered to have the best chance of actually becoming the Democratic nominee. There are a few others, such as Tom Steyer, who's actually doing well enough that he's been at most of the debates and gotten a decent number of votes and is doing fairly well in a few polls, but people don't really consider him likely to win. So what happens now? Well, as I said, 2 states have voted. Iowa had a caucus, which is a very complex thing that has a whole bunch of stages, takes hours to do, and in fact, it was run so poorly that the chair of the Iowa Democratic Party has already resigned. They still, almost 2 weeks later, have not officially certified a winner. There are tons of math errors and other problems that the New York Times has found in the voting records. The whole thing is a bit of a mess, and there was already criticism around Iowa being the first state to vote because it is over 90% white, which does not well represent the Democratic electorate, which has a lot more people of color. New Hampshire, meanwhile, while also still super white, at least had a normal primary that was run pretty smoothly. So what happens next? There's 2 states in February that will vote, Nevada and then South Carolina. And then on March 3rd, it's Super Tuesday, where a ton of states vote, including the 2 biggest states, California and Texas. as well as several states in New England, including Massachusetts, which I know a lot of you are from, Maine, and Vermont. If you live in Rhode Island or Connecticut, you don't vote until April 28th, and then you can find all the other primary and caucus states online. So because there is such a huge number of candidates, and because even though Sanders is sort of the front runner, he's still getting less than a third of the votes, it seems quite likely that it will be a long time before we actually know who the Democratic nominee will be. So that makes it all the more important to vote and get out there and make sure that your voice is heard if you are eligible to vote. The primaries last through June, and then there's the Democratic Convention in July. Now, while both 2008 and 2016 had a very close race for who would be the Democratic nominee that lasted through most of the spring, it was figured out by the time we got to the convention. However, there is a risk this year that because there are so many candidates splitting the vote, we might not even know until the convention who the Democratic nominee will be. Because if nobody has a majority, they have to start changing who they're voting for, and it's kind of a free-for-all. So it will be very interesting to see if we get there. I want to underscore why I think it's so important for you to know what's going on and to vote. These races aren't just about who this one person is that will be the president. They're about all the policies, they're about who else gets elected, because if you motivate more people on the Democratic side to vote, you're also likely to vote in more Democratic senators and representatives, for example, and to pass more progressive bills. Your vote does matter. Often elections are very close. In fact, in 2016, out of, I think, over 120 million votes cast, it came down to 70,000 votes in 3 states that pushed it over to Trump. And if you are as old as I am and remember 2000, Gore lost by less than, I think, 600 votes in the state of Florida, and that would have switched who won that election. So every vote does count. The other thing to consider is probably some of your friends are immigrants or under 18 or for some other reason may not be eligible to vote, and they really would appreciate if you would take the time to vote on their behalf as well. And if you just aren't familiar with a lot of the issues and don't really know where to go, talk to the people around you who you trust and see what they have to say, and listen and respect it, and think about if they're encouraging you to go to the polls, they probably have a good reason. I am encouraging you to go as well. Government policies have a very real effect on people's lives, so just keep that in mind and make sure to educate yourself. Go to vote.gov if you want to learn how to register to vote and how to find a polling place, and I hope that we will see you at the polls. If you like this video, if you have questions, if there's things that you would like me to cover or talk about, let me know. I would love to keep doing these as the Democratic primary continues and we move into the general election in November. Politics are going to be a big part of 2020, and I hope you remember to vote. Thank you for watching. I am Majenta with a J. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Definitely share this one if you are willing to. I think that it could potentially help people who are a little confused or overwhelmed understand a little bit better who's running and who they might want to consider supporting. Thank you for watching.